In today's video, I'm going to show you how to paint perfect shadows in your watercolor landscapes. Before we start, apologies for my hair. You know, you have a shower and then you put your hair up and you think, I'll do it properly in a minute. And then you're like at the end of the day and it's still doing what it was doing in the morning. So there's that. Now, I did a Facebook poll this week and I asked people in my Facebook group, link on the screen, what their frustrations were with painting shadows in landscapes, and got some interesting results. The thing that people are most concerned about is capturing sunlight. So we're going to cover that towards the end of this video. People were also very interested in cloud shadows and shadows in foliage and trees. And there was some concern as well about colour mixing. We're going to cover all of those things in today's video. So let's get started. So let's talk about colour mixing and shadow colours, both ready-made and those that you mix yourself. I'm going to give you some clever tips in this section. So let's look first of all at three colours I've swatched here, two of which are commonly found in most paint ranges. So we've got Payne's Grey, we've got Davies Grey, and this one is one of my own formulations, which is Summer Clouds, because we're talking about landscapes today. Now, you need to understand that shadows aren't inherently grey, and just dumping ready-made greys into your landscapes often will just make them muddy and murky. The only time shadows are grey is on white buildings and white surfaces, and of course grey surfaces themselves. So Payne's Grey, I find, is really useful for those reflections on white buildings, you know, those Mediterranean scenes. We've got strong dark shadows cast across white surfaces. Payne's Grey works well. Davies Grey is another common colour. This one is not really very suitable for landscapes. This is a great colour, very watered down for botanical shadows because it's slightly chalky, slightly opaque and slightly green based. This one here is one of my own formulations. So I've got two shadow colours in my ranges. One is Summer Clouds and one is Petal Shadow. Petal Shadow can also be used for clouds. It's a little more lilac than this mix here. I'm going to show you how to mix a colour like this in a moment. If you want details of my colours, they are in the video description. Let's look first at how to mix shadows in green areas, because the simplest way basically is just to add a dark blue. So if you think about the composition of green, and let's swatch some here. I've got some Daniel Smith green gold. Now the composition of any green, being blue and yellow, is going to be majority yellow. Have you ever put some yellow paint out and just touched it with, you know, the tiniest micron of blue paint? It immediately turns green. So the simplest way of making this darker, you could add a darker green, but you can also put a blue directly into it. I would avoid one of the brighter blues like phthalo. You could go for something strong and dark. I've got an indigo here. You could also use a warm blue like a cobalt or an ultramarine. This one is cobalt. It's not going to be too bright, but it's going to give you those darker shadows that you need. Let's look now at shadows on clouds. So we're going to mix this shadow from primaries, and you want to use wherever possible primaries that you've already used in your painting. So we're going to need a blue, a yellow, and rather than a red, we'll use a pink because that's the cooler version. So I've got some cerulean here. I've also just lent in my green paint there. So let's take my cerulean. Now any grey is going to be majority blue pigment, and cerulean's a weak pigment. So we're going to start with mostly cerulean. I'm going to add a tiny touch of lemon. Of course it will go green. I'm going to balance that out with a tiny touch of permanent rose, and it will start to push towards a grey. And we can start to swatch, and I've made a very muted blue-grey. I could easily make it stronger like this one up here just by adding more pigment. I could tip it towards lilac by adding more pink. I could tip it more towards grey by adding more blue and yellow and just a touch of pink. And in this way, we can mix our own cloud shadow colours from colours that we've already used in our painting. Lastly, let's look at another way of muting greens, which is to add the opposite colour. So if we don't want darker green areas like this, we want more muted areas, we can add the colour opposite. Now, most of you know that the opposite colour to green is red, but you don't want to use a scarlet-based red because this is going to turn this area brown. We want to just mute it and neutralise it. So instead, I'm going to use a pink, and as it mixes in, we get a more neutral, shadowy area. If you've got any areas that are more sandy or beachy, you could also experiment with using a lilac. You never want to use a Payne's grey to try and make an area of sand darker because there's too much blue in it and it'll interact with the yellow of the sand and you'll end up with green. So let's look at different types of shadows and different ways of applying them. Obviously, we get very hard-edged shadows during paintings where there's a lot of sunlight, and we'll look at that later on. But we also get soft shadows, and sometimes the easiest way to apply soft shadows, areas of shadow where you get sort of, maybe some meadows and you get clumps of grasses. The easiest way to apply these shadows is just to put them in as you paint. So I'm keeping everything sort of wet into wet here, and I just want some little areas of shadow, and I can go in, got my indigo here, rather a strong color. I'm only grabbing this one because it's quite close to me, but if you want a softer, more natural effect, you can go for ultramarine. If you want something brighter, you can go for phthalo. If you want something very understated, you could try a bit of cerulean. And we can easily add these softer areas of shadow in simply whilst we're painting. And we'll look at some other types of shadow and other ways of painting them next. I've painted a bit of a tree trunk here and this is dry. So let's look at now adding soft edge shadows which might have a hard edge on one side, say the edge of this tree, but then they fade softly in. Sometimes it's a good idea to add these afterwards, after the paint's dry. We can't do everything while the paint's wet. You can end up getting in a big old mess that way. So let's say that I want to add some shadow down certain areas of this tree. Now we'll need to pre-wet the paper, and I'll keep the water inside the tree because the paint will follow where the water is. So I don't want to put water outside of the tree. So I'm going to wet like this. It's important to note as well that just water alone can leave a drying mark. So sometimes you might want to take that water either across the whole area, even where there's not going to be paint, so that you avoid a drying line, or just be a little bit specific at where you end that water, so that if you do end up with a drying line, for instance, I can come around like this. If I end up with a drying line sort of at the base of this trunk, that won't look too bad, but I don't want one, for example, in a strange stripe down the middle of the tree. So I'm going to go down here. I'm now going to add some paint. I've got some sepia here, and you want to make sure that you add paint that's a little bit drier than the surface it's going onto. So I'm not adding much water to my brush. I can control the amount of water on my brush by using a piece of rag or paper towel. And here I am coming down here. If you're wondering how I did these marks, these stripes on the tree, I used a scalpel blade. I've got other videos on the channel that will teach you how to do that, so don't forget to subscribe. And here we can add some shadow in one place. Let's add some more. So I'm going to put some on this branch up here. So the shadow over here is on the left, so let's carry on that theme and come over to the left side here. And I can start to build up 3 dimensions onto my tree. At this point in the video, could I please remind you to click that like button, that thumbs up. Also, if you're watching this video when it's just come out, I do have a sale on my landscape course at the moment. There's a link in the description to all of my online courses. If there's not a sale on at the moment, the best time to find that is between Boxing Day and New Year, when I have a sale of all my online courses. The rest of the time you just need to be subscribed to my mail list and you'll find that you get discounts when new courses come out. I've even got some free courses, so make sure you have a look down there. If you download any of my free PDFs or take any of my free online courses, you'll get added to my mailing list. It's just a newsletter once a week which keeps you up to date with everything. Let's get back to the video. Don't forget to subscribe because this channel is fully cat approved. Let's look at a method for sort of negatively forming shadows. In other words, I'm going to go darker than I want, and then I'm going to lift out. Now you can always do that with a brush. I could rinse and dry my brush and just lift out a lighter area like this, but I'm going to actually use some blotting in this picture. So let's apply some paint, just using various colors here to get this rocky effect. Always apply more than one color when you can with watercolor painting, because it's just going to help to make everything look a little bit more interesting. So I've gone quite dark here. Now let's look at the idea of blotting out. And this works particularly, I use this particularly for rocks and mountainsides, because using paper like this is going to, if we crunch it up, it's going to give a very rocky effect. You can also use it if you have those rocks that have sort of, a square edge somewhere. We could come across like this, for example, and come down. And sometimes you need to go in, several times in order to get it looking nice and natural. And you can start to get these slightly square edged but very interesting shapes forming. And so you're forming the shadow areas negatively by lifting out the light areas. This is my favorite tip for painting rocks, and it also works if you've got distant mountains. So let's look at how to add shadows to clouds. Now, you do get some clouds with hard edges on, and I've got more extensive videos about clouds on this channel. I'll try and put a link to one of them in the video description if you need more help with painting cloudy skies. But if you've painted a sky like this, you might be finding that it's lacking a little bit in dimension. So what we want to do is add a bit of shadow into these clouds. It's best to do this after the paint's dry, at least if you can't work on it quickly enough, because beginners often work too long on their skies, leading to drying lines. It's best to put one colour on, let it dry, and then work in. We do have to be mindful as well that we need soft edges, and that water, especially on a blue sky like this, can leave a mark. So I'm going to pre-wet these areas, but I'm going to sort of stay away from this outside area. I don't want to take my brush around here. I'll just leave a line in the sky. And you also sometimes want to almost dry the edges there with your brush a little bit. And then I'm going to take some slightly wetter paint in my chosen shadow colour. Don't ask me what this colour is, it's just a bit of mud I've got in my palette. There we go. And we can come in like this. Now you might get one or two hard edges. You could take your brush and dry it and lift out a little bit there, or you might find that in places you want a little bit of a hard edge. You can also use this shadowy method to kind of break up areas. If you've ended up with a really large area of white, I know this one isn't, but if you've ended up with a large area of white and you want to sort of divide it up a bit, you can kind of use that cloud shadow colour to differentiate between areas. Start adding shadows to your clouds. It's really going to give your sky a sense of 3 dimensions. Now, the stronger the sunlight, the more you'll get strong, dark, hard-edged shadows. And this was the thing that was asked the most. And I'm going to show you in the next clip as well how to do this in a larger area. But this was what people were most interested in, was how to capture sunlight. And the answer is that you need strong lights and darks, and they need to have strongly defined edges. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going back in to this underneath dry area I've worked into, and I've worked some lights and darks in the first time round, but what I'm going to do now is leave some harder edges. Now you don't want it to look spotty, so we can join up some areas in the middle, but you do need to be patient with watercolor painting and allow some areas to dry, and in this way you'll get more of a sunlight effect. Let's look next at how to do it on a larger scale. Now, when you want strong sunlight, you need real dark, hard-edged, sharp shadows, because that's what happens in strong sunlight as opposed to softer occasions. And the biggest mistake that beginners make is to try and add these as they go through. Now, whether it's a landscape like this little one I've done here, or whether it's an urban situation with lots of buildings and things like that, people will try and build the shadows up. Now, they say in watercolor painting, work light to dark, and that is true. But there's also this idea that everything has to be layered, you have to keep layering. But let me tell you what happens. If I put a shadow across here, imagine we've got some really strong shadow across here. If I put that in halfway through, I'm going to find, because it's not quite dark enough now, I need to add another layer. I'll keep adding more layers. Maybe the paint's a bit damp. And what happens then is the edge of that shadow, because you can't paint on top of it in the exact same area every single time, because sometimes you didn't realize that your paper wasn't quite dry enough yet, trying to work all these layers up and keep layering onto your shadows. What happens is you lose the sharpness to that shadow, and so you lose the effect of strong sunlight. What you need to do on occasions like this, whether it's landscape or buildings, is you need to wait right until the end and throw your shadow across. You need to mix up enough paint to cover the area of the shadow because you don't want patchiness. And then you need to go in with your shadow boldly. I mean, there's nothing in this picture to cast shadows, so I'm just giving you an example here. You know, maybe there's a tree over here just off of my board, and we're putting this tree shadow in, or something like this. Doesn't really matter what the shadow is, but you need to pop that shadow in with confidence, and you need to leave it alone. Now, when you first paint a shadow like this, it's at the end of the picture, it's high risk. You're immediately going to think, oh my God, what have I done? I've completely messed it up. Hold your nerve, watercolor dries a lot lighter. You're going to find that you get those strong sunlight effects that you're looking for. So let me know in the comments if you found this video helpful and what was most eye-opening to you. Perhaps you've got some of your own landscape shadow tips that you can share with me. And with everyone else who watches these videos, don't forget to pop that in the comments so that we can all help each other out. And before you leave, don't forget to go into the description of this video, grab some of those free downloadables, and I'll put another video all about creating great landscapes up for you to watch right now.